Welcome back for those of you who were here yesterday. Welcome for the first time if you weren't. Just to explain the format, if you're wondering what's happened, particularly what's happened to lunch. Lunch is out there and there is someone guarding it, so no one else is going to steal it before you get there. We'd love to have it in here, but we're not allowed. At probably between 10 to and 5 to, when we finish, there'll be plenty of time to go and grab lunch as you chat and then head on to lectures afterwards. And what we'll try and aim to do is that I'll speak for no longer than 20 minutes. So then we have between 15 and 20 minutes for questions. We don't want to kind of squash that out. So please do text in. I haven't actually checked. Is that the right number? Can someone from CU confirm? I hope it is. Anyway, otherwise some guy is going to be getting text messages. I'm wondering what on earth is going on, which would be quite funny, wouldn't it? That did actually happen once. And just if you were here yesterday, it was very awkward. If you were here yesterday, some people were asking me the source of the survey about percentages of people's belief in God amongst the scientific community. So that's the link if you want to check out one of the sources of that. And someone else was asking further questions about the Alvin Plantinga evolutionary argument against naturalism. There's a very long link down there. If you can't get all that written down, you could just tweet me, and then I'll send you a link and a copy across to that, okay? So if those questions were questions that you had. But that's yesterday. Today, we're looking at this question, convinced the Bible is an irrelevant fairy tale. And really thinking about, can we trust the Bible at all? And is it of any relevance to us at all? Sometimes I meet people and they say, well, that's really nice you're a Christian, that's nice for you. But why has that got anything to do with me? You have your faith, I don't. It's irrelevant to me. And I guess the question of the relevance of the Bible, first of all, is really down to what the Bible actually is primarily. If the Bible is primarily just a set of philosophical teachings about life, or just a set of moral guidelines about how to live, then actually the Bible could quite well be irrelevant to many of us. We could say, well, those teachings are outdated, I don't like those philosophical ideas, it's irrelevant to me. So that may be how we'd respond. But actually, internally, if you've ever taken time to read the Bible, and we would really encourage you to do that, so that's why we're giving away those Uncover books, you'll discover actually that right at the heart of the Bible is not just a philosophical teaching or a set of moral guidelines, but it's a story of historical events. God breaking into human history. Now, of course, I'm not accepting that you all necessarily believe that yet, and we'll come to whether it's true or not in a second, but the nature of the claims of Christianity are not just philosophical ideas that you might like or dislike. They're not just moral teachings that you might follow or not. It's that there is a God who has actually broken into human history, and actually that, and our attitude towards that, and our response to that is of massive importance. C.S. Lewis said this. He said, Christianity is a statement which, if false, is of no importance, and if true, is of infinite importance, but the one thing it cannot be is moderately important. He's saying, actually, if these things happened, if this is actually true, if these claims about Jesus are real, then this is so important. And if they're not true, then actually, it's not just moderately important, it's not important at all. Christianity builds itself on historical claims, which, if not true, mean that the whole thing should fall down like a pack of cards. I mean, turn the churches into supermarkets, do something else with the Christian Union, because, well, the whole thing is based on a fabrication. So actually, if it's true, I want to say this is massively relevant. But of course, that leads probably to the big question for most of us here, which is, well, actually, how do we know that the Bible isn't just a fairy tale? You may say, well, of course, there might have been a historical person called Jesus. There may have been some historical events. But of course, the New Testament goes far beyond simply saying that there was a person called Jesus. It makes some massive claims, doesn't it, about who Jesus was and the kind of things Jesus did, and in particular, the resurrection of Christ, the foundation stone of it. And when you start to encounter things like that, of course, you might say, well, how on earth should we ever believe things like that? Richard Dawkins in The God Delusion says, the only difference between the Da Vinci Code and the Gospels is that the Gospels are ancient fiction, while the Da Vinci Code is modern fiction. He's saying, look, you may not take the Da Vinci Code as reliable, but neither should you take the Bible as reliable either. Now, why is that the case? I guess it may be the case for different reasons as you come here today. It may be that you've actually already started to investigate some of the historical evidence around the New Testament and the claims that it makes. And you've got questions about that. Or maybe you're a kind of secret closet historian who's kind of sneaked into Bath by some accident, and you've got those kind of historical questions. But of course, it may be actually that your questions about the Bible are more presuppositional. They start before you even get to the historical evidence. And by that I mean, a lot of us, or a lot of people, may say something like this. Well, I can't accept the Bible at all. I'm not even going to go there because the Bible makes ridiculous claims, doesn't it, about a person who walked on water and raised the dead and healed the sick and so on. And we know that things like that don't happen, okay? We know that miracles don't happen. Therefore, we aren't even going to begin to investigate the New Testament because we know that it can't be true. Maybe that's what you're thinking. One of the things that you have to think about, though, is are we in danger of arguing in a circular fashion when it comes to this issue? What I mean is this. Let me, again, sorry to quote C.S. Lewis so much. My excuse is it was his 50-year anniversary of his death on Friday, so maybe I can quote him a bit more. But he said this. He said, now, of course, we must agree with Hume that if there is absolutely uniform experience against miracles, if, in other words, they have never happened, why, then they never have. Unfortunately, we know the experience against them to be uniform only if we know that all the reports of them are false. And we can know that all the reports of them to be false only if we know already that miracles have never occurred. In fact, we're arguing in a circle. See, what he's saying is, actually, to say that miracles cannot happen, we must be able to discount every claim that a miracle has happened. And to be able to do that, because that would be a pretty big thing, we must already know that miracles can't happen. Maybe you're not following me, let me try and put it another way. I was having a conversation with a guy and I said, have you ever read the New Testament document? Have you ever looked into the historical claims? And he said no, because I know that miracles can't happen. And I said, well, here's a historical book claiming that miracles did happen. And he said, but it can't be true, because miracles can't happen. You see, he's saying, I'm not even going to start to look at the potential evidence because I've already made up my mind. I've already come to my conclusion, and I'm going to discount any evidence to the contrary, which I think would actually be a mistake, wouldn't it? It'd be saying, I've so fixed my mind to this conclusion that I'm not willing to even start to look at the evidence that might contradict it. Which would be a very unscientific way to go about it. Now, I'm not saying, please don't hear me saying this, I'm not saying you've got to come and say, okay, God exists, miracles happen, now I'm going to investigate the Bible. Of course not. You can still come with your presupposition, all of us do. But we do have to at least have the openness of mind to say, I might possibly be wrong on this. Okay? My experience of life, my experience of existence is that miracles don't happen. I don't think they happen. But what if there was actually compelling reasons to think that they might have, at least one time in history, happened? Have the openness of mind to do that. Another thing that you might want to think is this. Well, some people might say, hang on a minute though, but miracles, aren't they contradictions of the laws of nature? If we're going to start believing in the miracles of the Bible, how is that going to affect our view of the world? Does it mean that we have to kind of discount the laws of nature and the laws of science? Well, firstly, it's worth saying this. It's the laws of nature that actually allow us to identify a miracle in the first place. Okay? So it's because we know what normally happens that you'll be able to identify something that is happening that's different. And secondly, I'd say the laws of nature tell us what normally happen, given no outside interference. And let me try and give you two illustrations to maybe help you think about this. Firstly, imagine I'm staying just down the road here in Bath this week. Imagine back home, I have £10, in fact I do, I have £10 coins in my suitcase in my house where I'm staying with my hosts. And imagine if I get home tonight and I look in my suitcase and I find £5 coins, not 10. Now what do I say? Do I say, wow, the laws of arithmetic have been broken. I've only got £5 coins left. Of course not. I would say, no, the laws of England have been broken. Someone's nicked my £5, okay? Someone's got into my suitcase. So someone's got involved. Let me give you another illustration. Imagine if I got this book here, okay, from the bookstall, and imagine I decide I'm going to throw it across the room at my colleague Gareth, who's sitting over there with the mobile phone, okay? Sorry, Gareth. And imagine if I was to throw it, I would to work out kind of the trajectory and everything else, and I would throw this and I would get it just right, so it would hit him on the nose, okay? The laws of gravity and propulsion and everything else will tell you exactly how that book will fly through the air and hit my colleague on the nose. But imagine if, as I'm throwing this across, Becca, who's sitting next to Gareth, suddenly thinks, Michael's not being very nice to his colleague. And so she jumps up as the book is in midair, and she grabs it before it hits his nose. Now, you don't say, the laws of gravity and etc. have been broken. You say, well, someone's got in the way. Someone's stopped what would have happened otherwise, okay? Now, if you can take and put those illustrations in your mind, try and think about it this way. The laws of nature tell us what normally happen. But what if there was a God who created those laws of nature, who at one point in history got involved in history? We wouldn't say that the laws of nature have been broken, but what if someone had got involved in that situation, so that what normally happens didn't happen there? We're not saying that therefore we discount the laws of nature in all occasions because of that. They identify what a miracle is. Or the other thing you might be saying when you come to this issue is this. My problem is that it would just be too big for me to change my mind on this. You're asking me, an intelligent 21st century student at the University of Bath to believe in something like miracles. I mean, I'm not a kind of Bath Spa student, I don't believe those kind of crazy things. I'm not an artist, I'm a scientist, okay? I know these things aren't true. It would just be too big a kind of presupposition for me to overcome. Maybe that's what you're thinking, okay? What's interesting is this. I think we often assume that the first followers of Jesus were some kind of simple folk that were just more predisposed to believing in these kind of fairy stories than we are. And that they started writing and believing these things because they were somehow more inclined to it. Whereas actually, I think, as you look at the worldview of first century people, particularly Jewish and Roman people in the first century, for them to believe what they did about Jesus was no less a stumbling block or barrier given their presuppositions than it is for us, perhaps even more. But just for different reasons. You see, for first century Jews, many of whom started following Jesus, the idea that God had stepped into human history as a human being, lived on planet Earth, died at the hands of their hated enemies, the Romans, and then 3 days later risen from the dead physically in the middle of history, I can tell you was no more part of their worldview than it is part of ours. No more part of their expectations than it is for us. They were not expecting things like that to happen. It was completely out of the ordinary. It wasn't just a natural evolution of their worldview and thinking. And so for them to come to the conclusions that they did about Jesus was not just kind of a naturally easy step for them to make. It was a massively radical step. And it wasn't because it was easy that they believed it, but actually I think because they were convinced by the evidence around them that this was the conclusion about Jesus that they'd got. Now, you might be saying, okay, you haven't even looked at the Bible yet. Well, admittedly, you haven't. But I wanted to say those things because one of the problems when we come to the New Testament is we have all these presuppositions that mean we don't even start to investigate it. And I would say, sure, we all come with our presuppositions, but let's not put them on one side, but at least have the open-mindedness to think that we might possibly be wrong, and then let's look at it. And so we really would encourage you to look at the claims of the New Testament. That's why we're giving you those Uncover Gospels for free. It's written by a guy called Luke, who was a medical doctor and a historian, who wrote down the eyewitness evidence that he had gathered as a contemporary of Jesus. And then that document was widely spread at the time. And so we're encouraging people to go away and have a look. Now there's two problems people have when they start to look at the Bible. There's a problem that some Christians have, it's this. They say, well, the Bible is God's words. And as God's word, the Bible says it's true, so it must be true. Okay? That kind of circular reasoning. It's like, I believe it because I believe it. I believe it simply because it's the Bible. And of course, that would be a ridiculous reason to believe something, wouldn't it? But you could go the other way. And the problem that other people make is this. They say, well, the Bible, that's not historical evidence, because it's the Bible. It's a religious book. And we don't even ask the questions about whether it has any reasons for being taken reliably. We just immediately reject it. And I would say there's a mistake of just immediately accepting it, and there's a mistake in immediately rejecting it. You need to actually ask the questions, are there reasons to take it as a reliable source? Now, I'm not going to look at the whole of the Bible, that would take far too long, and we've got about 5 minutes left before questions. But actually, taking particularly the claims of the New Testament and the Gospels, which centre on the person of Christ, on which Christianity is based, what are we to make of those? There's a few things worth bearing in mind. Firstly, who wrote them? Some people kind of have this idea that the New Testament was written hundreds of years after, as a kind of Roman invention, after Constantine and stuff like that. But actually, we know that that is not the case, and there's very good reasons to say that. We've got manuscript evidence, in fact, of the New Testament from as early as 125 AD. This is a fragment of John's Gospel. If you want to see it, you can go to Manchester, to the John Rylands Library, and have a look. And lots of other manuscripts through the 2nd and then 3rd centuries, which, according to historians, is actually a very small time gap compared to other books from antiquity. So to say it was written 200 years later doesn't fit actually with the physical evidence of the manuscript evidence. And that, of course, isn't the original copy of John's Gospel. The original copy would have been well before that. So these things were not written much later. They were written actually by eyewitnesses. If you want to look into that, there's a guy called Richard Borkham, Professor Richard Borkham, who's written a book, came out about 5 years ago, called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. And he's done a lot of scholarly research saying that actually when we're looking at the New Testament, there's many good reasons to say that these things are written down by not only contemporaries of Jesus, but contain eyewitness evidence. And that's important, isn't it, for a start? The Gospel's not been made up hundreds of years later by people who weren't there. There's good reasons to think actually they were written by people who were physically there and saw these events. Now you might be saying, okay, but eyewitnesses alone doesn't necessarily prove reliability. Granted, okay? Might be that they made it up, they had other motives and stuff like that. So you've got to ask the question, okay, what kind of motives might these eyewitnesses had for either telling the truth or for making it up, for fabricating it? Were they biased? And again, people say, well, these people had lots to gain. They had, political motivation, or they had financial motivation, or so on. Forgetting that actually Christianity had no political power until the 4th century and Constantine came along. When the Gospels were being written in the 1st century, actually all of the weight of the Jewish and Roman authorities was focused on squashing and stopping this Christian movement. And so actually, what did the eyewitnesses have to gain from making these claims about Jesus? Persecution, opposition, and in many occasions, physical death. Which is interesting, isn't it? Why on earth did these people make these outrageous claims when there was such hostility when they made them? Now, if they were true, and if they were convinced they were true, then that might explain it. But why, if they were just fabricating these stories, would each one of them go to their dying days holding that these things were true? People may, of course, die for things that aren't true, but people don't die for things that they know aren't true. Now, of course, other people say, well, these eyewitnesses, maybe they were forgetful. They didn't write down the Gospels until later in their lives. Maybe they forgot certain events. How could we trust what they say? We have to think about the nature at this point of what they're actually writing about. You may forget a lot of stuff. I can't remember what I had for dinner last Wednesday. In fact, I can't remember what I did for dinner on Saturday. Little details in our lives are easily forgotten, aren't they? But there are some details that are not forgotten. I was with some friends on Saturday who just got engaged, and I was told in meticulous detail, down to the timings of the minutes, what had happened on the day that they got engaged. She wanted to tell me at 6:03 this happened, and at 6:06, because it was a huge, monumental day. And I could guarantee that in a few years' time, she will know still the very finest details of that day. So when big things happen, you're less likely to forget. Think about it. You don't get much bigger than the claim that God has stepped into human history and done the kind of things that the Bible reports. They're not the kind of things you're going to forget too easily. And suddenly oh, did he rise from the dead? Oh, I can't remember. It's just not going to happen, is it? But another thing that's worth thinking through is this as well. Not only the evidence for the person of Jesus, but actually, is there evidence against it? Imagine I was to make up a story about Josh. Okay, can I pick on you, Josh? Is that all right?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, Josh is down here. We met yesterday, and I met Josh because he was unicycling, so I thought this was kind of cool. So he can give you a demonstration outside later. But imagine I was to write a story about Josh, and I was to serialise it in your newspaper. Do you know what your newspaper's called?
Bath Impact.
Sorry?
Bath Impact.
Bath Impact, okay? I was in Wales last week and I couldn't even pronounce the name of the student newspaper. So in Bath Impact, and I tell this story about Josh, and I say, Josh, you think he's just a nice guy, but actually, Josh is divine. And he's been doing incredible things. He's been going around, not only unicycling across the university, but walking across the lake. Not just because it was frozen like this morning, but when it wasn't frozen. And he's been curing people of freshers' flu. And he's brought his packed lunch into university and he's fed thousands. And I managed to somehow get this reported in the student newspaper. And it's all there. Now, firstly, is anyone going to believe that? Josh might believe it. His mum, no, I'm not sure. Even Josh would. But we're not going to, because many of you know Josh. You might think, well, he's a lovely guy and he can unicycle, but he can't do that. Now imagine, for some reason, I managed to get people to start to believe what I'm saying. And I get people to say, well, yeah, I think this is true. Do you think there might be some other people who want to say, hang on a minute, that's not true. We know, Josh, that didn't happen. You're making it up. There'd not only be my evidence, but there would, of course, be lots of people willing to say the opposite and give other explanations. Again, one of the fascinating things about the New Testament is the complete lack of contradictory evidence from the first century, giving alternative explanations for Jesus and this Christian movement. It's not to say that there isn't other explanations about Jesus, but they often come in the 2nd and 3rd century after the eyewitnesses have died. And again, that's a fascinating thing to look at. I have only scratched the surface on that. I'm sure you want to come back to ask more in a second. But I was reading in the Times newspaper just recently something quite fascinating. Matthew Paris, not a Christian at all, an atheist, but he said this, which I thought was interesting. He said, one of the reasons we can be pretty sure Jesus actually existed is that if he had not, the church would have never invented him. And that's to say, actually, one of the things that's so fascinating about the actual Jesus, the Jesus of the Gospels, is that he's so different to our presuppositions. I think sometimes the reason why we never check out Jesus, we maybe never even look at the evidence, is that we have a kind of presupposition of gentle Jesus, meek and mild, that just seems rather boring. Why would I be interested in him? And yet, actually, when you start to look at the person of Jesus, you can find that he's incredibly fascinating. He breaks our presuppositions in two. And he is far more exciting than we could ever think. He doesn't just reinforce the religious establishments. Often he undermines much of the religious establishment with his teaching and the way that he lives. So don't just think about whether the New Testament is true, but actually look at it and say, if this was true, if this person of Christ really lived and these things happened, what difference would this make? So is the New Testament a fairy tale? Is the Bible a fairy tale? Well, I want to say no. But in another way, you might say yes. What do I mean by that? Very quickly, in a minute before we finish and have questions. You may have seen these two guys. I've mentioned C.S. Lewis a number of times, and Tolkien, the guy on the right. Tolkien was a Christian when C.S. Lewis wasn't. C.S. Lewis was an Oxford scholar and an atheist. And C.S. Lewis said that one of his biggest problems with the Christian faith is this. He said, look, the whole story is just a myth. It's just another fairy tale. He says, look, I love myths, and he was an expert in myths. But he said, look, it's just another myth. Like all the other myths. Why should I believe it? And one night they went for a walk by the river in Oxford. And Tolkien was talking to Lewis as Lewis repeated this issue that he had with the Christian faith. And Tolkien said to Lewis, but what if it was a true myth? What if, on one occasion, the myth actually happens? That it didn't just remain a fairy tale, but it actually took place in human history. And this is really compelling for Lewis. And later on, he wrote about this himself. He said, the heart of Christianity is a myth, which is also a fact. The old myth of the dying God, without ceasing to be myth, comes down from the heaven of legend and imagination to the earth of history. It happens at a particular date, in a particular place, followed by definable historical consequences. We pass from a boulder or an Osiris dying no one knows where, to a historical person, crucified. It's all in order, under Pontius Pilate. He's saying, actually, this isn't just a myth happening a long, long time ago, far, far away. It's rooted in real history, and it really happens. And if it really did happen, then it's absolutely relevant. Now listen, we want time for questions, so I'm going to invite our host back up. Thank you. Just while we're sorting those questions, and Gareth, I think, writing them down, so he'll come back up as well. And let me say two things. Firstly, there are two brilliant books on this subject. Why Trust the Bible by Amy or Ewing. That's out on the bookstall. Does kind of what it says on the tin. And this little book called Jesus for Skeptics by Michael Green, who was a New Testament scholar and a Christian who's really just helpfully condensed some kind of heavy stuff down into a very readable book, Jesus for Skeptics. And all of the books on the bookstall this week are £1 if you're a guest of the CU. So they're subsidised down, especially. Have a look. Gareth will be on the bookstall later and he can help you out with that. So, Gareth, do you want to come up with the questions? Is that okay? Have you got the... No? Okay.
Yeah, if we just while we wait for the questions to come in and have a look at them, you just grab the feedback form on your desk, and we'd really love to hear your comments. So if you could just fill that out, and then we'll have a couple of minutes to do that, and then we'll have the questions in a second. So yeah, if you just grab the pen on your desk and fill that out, would be great. And I'll just draw your attention to the two boxes. There's one that says "Tell me more" and one that says "Count me in." So if you're really interested in this and you want to have more information, you can tick "Tell me more" and someone will get back to you if you leave your name and your number. And if you're really agreeing with everything that Michael said and you really think this is something that you believe in, then tick on "Count me in" and someone will get back to you really promptly with to be able to answer any of the questions that you have. Yeah, that'd be great.
Great. Fantastic. Fill those in while we have the Q&A now. That would be great. Go for it.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, so our first question we've got is, how can you claim that the accounts of Jesus' life are true when there are no contemporaneous records and the first canonical gospel wasn't written until at least 100 years after his death by third-hand witnesses?
Okay. So how do you know that the Gospels about Jesus are true when there's no contemporary evidence and the earliest Gospels were written at least 100 years later by third-hand witnesses? Firstly, I want to say, actually, what I'm saying and what many historians are saying is that the Gospels are written by contemporary witnesses of these events. Luke himself claims not to be a witness, although he's a contemporary, he's still within the same generation. And if you read the early first paragraph of his document in that book on cover, he says that I've looked into it, I've interviewed the eyewitnesses, so he's still alive at the time. And actually there's good reason for saying actually these Gospels were written at that point. One of them, but not the only one, is the fact that we've got part of John's Gospel, the last Gospel generally regarded to be written, a copy of it found in Egypt, not where it was written, from 125 AD, which is less than 100 years later, and that's not the original manuscript evidence that we have for it. Okay? And so actually there's very good reasons for saying that these things were written early. And even amongst scholars who are not Christian, the idea that the Gospels were written over 100 years later is generally disregarded now, because there is very strong reasons to say they must have been written earlier. Okay? Also, the question of whether they're eyewitness, I really would encourage you to check out that stuff by Richard Borken. He's looked into that and said actually there's good reasons for saying not only are they written early, but they're written by people who clearly were eyewitnesses and around at the time and had access to this information. Okay? Great question.
Okay. The next question is, you can create a circular argument about anything that you don't believe in. Miracles, unicorns, chocolate teapots orbiting the earth. If we should open our minds and believe in miracles, why not believe in anything ever claimed by anyone? You would end up with a set of beliefs not only ridiculous but contradictory.
Yeah, great question, thank you. So what I was trying to say in the talk was not to say you've got to therefore be just a gullible, naive so-and-so who believes every report. Can I actually say, I'm a Christian and I'm highly sceptical about many reports of the miraculous, okay? So I don't necessarily believe, because someone says, in Africa last week there was this incredible... hang on. Just because I'm a Christian and I believe in God, and I believe that miraculous can happen, doesn't mean that I believe that miraculous always does happen or every report is therefore reliable. What I'm saying is actually you've got to actually do the work and say, is there good reasons to think that this may have happened? And are there more plausible alternative explanations given what we know and given the evidence that we have to hand? So I would say it's exactly the same thing that we have to do with the New Testament. Not become a gullible, naive person who says, well, of course they happen because miracles will always happen. No, I think you can still maintain a high degree of skepticism, but at the same time investigate whether there's good reasons to think they might have done. Okay? And so it's not asking you to be naive at all. I think it is saying, though, you've got to at least be open to the fact that they might have done, even if your presupposition is still that they don't happen. And if there's evidence that points to the fact that at least at one point they haven't, then I will believe that. But just because I believe that in the person of Christ, God has intervened in history, it doesn't mean that I necessarily think that every report of the miraculous before or since is therefore absolutely true. No, I want to examine those too, and decide on the basis of what I have available to me, whether I think they're true or not. Okay? Great question.
Thank you. This is another question about miracles. So, some suspension in the laws of the universe to your benefit, either that has actually happened and is incredible, or you have misunderstood or made a mistake about what has actually happened. Which do you really think is the more likely option?
Sorry, just trying to. Some suspension in the laws of the universe to your benefit. Earlier, that has actually happened, and it's incredible that you've misunderstood or made a mistake about what's that. Sorry, I'm just trying to make it sense.
That's a definition of miracles.
Okay, sorry. Lecture in the universe for your benefit. Yeah, okay, sorry. So the definition of miracles is some suspension in the laws of the universe for your benefit. Either that has actually happened, or it's incredible and you've missed or made a mistake about what has actually happened. I think I'd say, yeah, it is a massive claim, isn't it? Yeah, I remember talking to someone recently, and we were talking about the resurrection claim, and they said, come on, things like that don't happen every day. I'm like, yeah, absolutely. That's why we're talking about it. You know, if they did happen every day, we wouldn't be talking about this. So there is something incredibly huge. That's why I'm saying, you know, if these things are true, they are massively relevant, aren't they? But just because they are incredible, because they're big, I'm saying that doesn't mean we should just therefore automatically discount them. It may mean, of course, that we come to them with a high degree of suspicion, particularly if we're coming with a materialistic mindset in the 21st century. But actually, there are many people who have come to these claims with a high degree of suspicion and skepticism, and have taken time to investigate the evidence, and have found that actually, having done so, that they've changed their mind on it. So those that are willing to really look at it, I think it's possible, quite possible, to see that actually there's good reasons to believe this. So it's a huge thing, absolutely. So that's why you should check it out.
So how can you prove the mental health and well-being of the eyewitnesses who wrote the gospel? Surely this factor is vital in assessing the reliability of anything written by them.
Okay. How can you prove the mental health or well-being of the people writing the Gospels? Obviously, I haven't met any of the Gospel writers, so I can't go and do that. You might say, well, they were just nutters, they were just making stuff up, or they were crazy, or stuff like that. I think what's interesting is obviously the New Testament as a collection of documents is not just written by one person, but a whole different selection of authors. So that's one thing. Are we saying that these are all mental cases? That all had the same mental condition, obviously, in believing these kind of delusions? So we've got a whole variety of people that we're looking at. And lots of other people who seem to find their beliefs and their teaching very convincing and very compelling. And so I think firstly, that's going to be rather suspicious that they've all had the same mental condition. And secondly, of course, you can read it. You could read through Luke's Gospel. Now you might say, well, why would I do that? Listen, I've got a friend who was one of the highest skeptics that you could meet. And he thought, there's nothing in this. And his first step was actually just to read a copy, not of Luke's Gospel, but actually John's Gospel. And actually, as he read it, he just found there was something very compelling about it. This didn't sound like the work of a mental case. It sounded very measured. You know, if I was trying to, con you all into believing something, I think I would have employed a lot more hyperbole and exaggeration for a start. Very measured, very real. And that was the start in that journey. Actually looking at it, reading it, does this sound like the work of a mental case? And you might put that as a hypothesis, but actually does that work? Given gospel accounts that we have, given the way that they're borne out by other evidence. And again, to talk about Borkham's book, he's done a lot of work saying actually there's ways that we can check the reliability, not of course, the whole of the New Testament, but lots of things that the gospel writers did. And to actually ask the question, does this fit with what we know of reality? Does this sound like it's made up? And then you can compare that with books like the Gnostic Gospels, which we do know are made up because they were written 200 years later by people who were not eyewitnesses. And they're called Gospel of Thomas, Mary and stuff like that, but they're pseudonyms to give them a cloak of respectability. And when you compare the books that clearly were made up 200 years later, and the mistakes that they make about geography and places and names and details, compared to the books that were not made up, the Gospel accounts, there's a very strong difference between those. So actually you can start to look at the difference in those kind of books as well. Okay, how are we doing? Time for one or two more?
Yeah.
One more?
So we've got this one that says, while Constantine might not have written the Bible, surely the Romans and the church over time could select which passages to include in order to control the population via a strict moral code in line with the church's interests.
Yeah. Okay, so a good question, because you might say, well, okay, the Gospel accounts obviously were written earlier, but has it been doctored, changed, or manipulated by the Catholic Church from the time of Constantine onwards? Well, I would rely upon the fact that actually all our manuscripts of the New Testament would have to date post-Constantine. I would have to say that actually what's happened at Constantine is some kind of deliberate changing, some deliberate manipulation, and some deliberate destruction of anything that is different to that. But again, what you'll come across when you look into the manuscript evidence is that many of the manuscripts of the New Testament date from before the time of Constantine. We can put together, in fact, the whole text of the New Testament from the different manuscripts from before the time of Constantine. So what Constantine was not able to do was to somehow change or manipulate the New Testament text, because if he had, in the 4th century, that would be abundantly obvious for all of us to see. And actually what we can do is we can see what the New Testament texts were well before Christianity gained political power, and we can see that actually that isn't changed or manipulated. Now what did happen, because there is a grain of truth sometimes in some of these accusations, is that during the time of Constantine, the church officially agreed which books are in the New Testament. That's often where people kind of get this idea from. They say, well, the church picked these books to be in and the others that are out. What actually was happening there was this. Before the 4th century, Christianity has no political power. There's no established church. There's groups of people meeting in different places, loving Jesus, following him. And then suddenly the church does have an establishment. It has power. It has, and actually I have to say, as a Christian, that wasn't the best moment for the Christian church in history at all. But because of that, it now can make kind of official decrees and statements. And so it starts to, particularly in response to maybe other sects and cults of Christianity that start to get different ideas, like the Gnostics in the 3rd and 4th centuries. And so what they did is they officially recognized that there were these books that are reliable historical books. They also treated ultimately as God's word, which were the most reliable ways to discover the real person of Christ. And there were other books, like the Gnostics, which were clearly written much later, that weren't so reliable for finding out about Jesus. And they recognized that, but they didn't just kind of pick them out at random. We actually have a fragment called the Moratorian fragment that dates from the end of the 2nd century, which has pretty much all the New Testament books listed as they're now known in our modern day versions of the Bible. So it seems that actually the New Testament was already pretty much collected together into a group of books before the Roman Empire recognized Christianity, before those decrees were ever officially met. So it wasn't that they were officially changing anything or appointing anything, but more recognizing what had already been accepted over a long period of time. Okay? Just looking at the time, we probably need to finish, don't we?